In this presentation, we will discuss the expectations for the final project, both Part 1 and Part 2. As an overview, the final project that's been assigned to the 407 part of the class is a literature review. So picking a specific theme related to fire ecology and management and finding out how GIS informs that specific theme or question. There is also the option to participate in the project that 510 is doing, and this is something that I would recommend for those of you that are working on projects dealing with GIS data already, and you have the option to just add an additional question to that project, or if you already have a little bit more familiarity with doing some independent work in GIS. So go ahead and check both of them out and see which one's the best fit for you, and you're welcome to ask questions and see which one might work best for you, especially if you're choosing the 510 option and you want to run some ideas by for different projects that you might choose. So in Part 1 of this project, here is your mission. You've been asked by your supervisor to do some research into an issue important to your area and see how others are using GIS to help inform their questions on the topic. For example, you could answer, how does GIS inform the question of whether mastication in juniper-encroached shrublands reduces fire severity? Or, how do wildfires affect the spread of cheatgrass into native grasslands? Those are just a couple of examples, and there's many out there. Something to keep in mind is that all of the papers you choose don't have to apply precisely to the questions you're asking, but rather should demonstrate how GIS can be used to address your question or similar questions. For example, for the cheatgrass spread example question, you might find articles describing how fire affects the spread of other invasives or other non-natives, or simply how fire patterns influence plant community distribution. It's unlikely that you'll find 5 articles specifically on your question. So as a hint, it's a good idea to find the first one and then explore their references for good additional papers. Now, the overall point here of finding these papers is that it's important to understand that in scientific literature and in scientific work that is done in fire ecology management, GIS is a really, really important part. And it might not, again, the paper might not even specifically say GIS. It might say, talk about the way that remote sensing was used, or just imagery in general, or some kind of analysis. And so you'll have to do a little bit more digging into the methods section of those papers to see what you can tease out about how they use GIS to answer their question. So here is what you'll need to complete the first part of the project. The first ones, you need to define your question. So how does GIS inform the fire ecology and or fire management question of ... So that's the first step. The second step is you're going to be finding 5 articles that will be used to answer the question and will eventually be used to create a presentation on the topic. At least 3 of the articles will need to come from peer-reviewed sources, which we'll talk about in a little bit. These sources need to be in alphabetical order and formatted to the style of the CNR writing guide, which is attached in this assignment. So when you can scroll down, the examples are listed, similar to if you've seen a book for MLA or APA, how to format those citations. It's just about where the periods go, where the dates go, if you italicize anything or bold anything. So here's some tips for success on this first part of the project. The first one is to review all the requirements first, both for the first part of the project and the second part of the projects, so that you make sure that you understand what's expected of you and that you're building a good foundation of work for this first step. The second one is start with a really general theme for your research, say mastication or fuel treatments or smoke emissions, and then choose the exact topic based on what you find most available and most interesting. So don't box yourself in with a really specific question right away. Look around at the literature and see what you find first. And like I mentioned, many articles might not explicitly say that they're using GIS, but if they're talking about remote sensing or other methods of taking imagery or comparing large-scale landscapes and that kind of thing, that's what they're referring to, and they should detail some things in their methods sections. What you might find is that some papers are better at it than others, and so you might find 8 or 9 or 10 papers and then pick those 5 that have a better method section that talks about more specifically the work that they did with GIS. And then after doing some initial work to dig on your topic, if you are having a hard time, then you ask for help. Now the key here is that it's important to do a little bit of work on your own. You might start out looking at this and be a little bit confused, but it's important to get started, get looking around, and then when you have questions, they'll be a little bit more informed and you'll be able to understand the answers to them a little bit better. And obviously, solving problems on your own is the best way to go if you can. So in the end, your deliverable is going to be to take the attached template, which I'll pull up here, and start with filling out your question. So how does GIS inform the fire ecology or the fire management, depending on what you're choosing, of ... And then a short description of why you chose this question. So for example, you could start out with, for several years I've been interested in the way that cheatgrass is studied, or the way that cheatgrass has invaded the Great Basin because I lived there, or whatever it might be, the reason that it interests you. So a couple sentences there. And then you have your bibliography. So you will have your citations for the paper that you've written, and these will be formatted in the style of the CNR Writing Guide. And each of them will have 3 to 6 sentences summarizing the article as a whole. So what's it about? That would come from information from the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion, and then also touching on how the paper uses GIS. So you'll have those 5 references, 3 of which would come from peer-reviewed sources. And then this is a rubric for how you'll be graded. So this is going to be worth a total of 80 points for your part 1. And so make sure that you are giving the proper weight in terms of attention and time to each of these categories. And when you're done, make sure to check through all of these and realize that you will be graded for your grammar and your formatting and all those things. So make sure you're complying with those grading things. Also, notice that I have this little note: remove the text in italics, so you can remove why this question. You can remove that, and you can remove the rubric when you submit it. So your part 1 is going to be due next week, so on the 29th, the evening of the 29th. So make sure to have that completed by then, and then you'll have several weeks to do your part 2. So before I go into part 2, I'm going to help you find those peer-reviewed and other articles that might be related to your topic. So there's a couple different ways to do this. We're going to start with going to the library, the University of Idaho Library. And here you can search articles or journals. And so what I'm actually going to do, I prefer to go to one of these search engines. Just like you have Google or Bing or other search engines, each of these has different abilities to search, and so it's a good thing to check a couple. So one that I like is Web of Science. One little note that you should remember is that in order to access the full text to these articles, you'll need to be logged into the University of Idaho's library system. So you can do that on the library page. You can log in there, or you can access it from campus if you are on campus. So here's the search page, and so we've got a couple different options. So we'll start with, let's just say, cheatgrass, and I like to add a different field here, and so we'll just do fire. So both of these are topics. You could also do author or date or things like that. So we'll do cheatgrass, fire, and I'm going to add another field, and I'm going to just say GIS and see what comes up. So no results for GIS. Let's see if I can use remote sensing. So we've got mapping and monitoring cheatgrass in rangelands of the Northern Great Basin. So this is a really good candidate of a starting paper. So we would click on it, and you can either go to the Find It button. To get to the full text from these pages is sometimes a little cumbersome. So I look around, let's see if it's got, look up full text. So this actually, that was a link to Google Scholar, which is another place that I was going to show you. So going to Google Scholar, to get there, you'd actually want to go to, you just search scholar.google.com. and here's where you would do any of your searching, and this is just, again, another search engine to find information. But here we have it. So we've got the full text, and before I click on this, I want to show you a really useful button, and it's this button here for citing. So you click Cite, and it has the citation already created for you. Now you'll want to look at the CNR Writing Guide and see the general style that's in there, and then you'll pick the one that's the closest. So I think this one's pretty close, the Harvard style. So you would copy this, and you would paste it into your template here. And then you do your reformatting. So you would make this not italics. You would change where the initials of the names are, and that kind of thing. So this is a really great way to get your citations relatively quickly. I usually save the formatting of the citations for near the end, just so that I make sure that I have time to find all the papers, which is the most important part. So I'm going to view the full text here. So it brings me to the Science Direct page. That's the page that it brings you to is just going to depend on where it's published. And this is the HTML version. I prefer to look at the PDF version, so I'm going to go ahead and download the PDF. This shows all of the figures in the proper place, and it's just a little easier to read for me at least. Now, reading a scientific paper can be somewhat of a challenge, and so it takes a little bit of practice. So take your time initially to make sure that you're understanding what's being talked about. I find that it's hard to understand anything in the paper before I have a really solid idea about what the big picture is. So I'll read the abstract really carefully, making sure I understand what their question was that they were answering, and then what their final conclusions were. And again, for this paper, you're going to be focusing a little bit more on their method section. So go ahead and read through the abstract and the introduction and get an idea of the area, and then start to kind of break down what actually happened in the paper. So we've got a study area composed of different types of vegetation covers, and then it looks like we have some data here with NDVI. Now NDVI is a term that you were introduced to just briefly. It's another way to measure the difference or the change over time in vegetation. For our exercise, we used NBR, or normalized burn ratio, and this is normalized difference vegetation index, which tends to be better in grassy areas, which is why it's used. And MODIS is just another satellite, which is similar to what we used for land. So we used Landsat before, Landsat imagery, and this is MODIS imagery. So again, similar process. We're taking imagery from a satellite, and we're doing some manipulation to that image, and we are interpreting the change that we are getting from that. So we have a definition of NDVI. And so just with the basics of what you've learned from our exercises, you can interpret this a little bit. You understand that they're having the near infrared from that electromagnetic spectrum minus the red band, and the near infrared plus the red band. So again, similar to that NBR value that we have. So read through this and try to understand, work through the basics. And if you are unfamiliar with a term in any of the papers that you read, then it's your task to look up that term and find out how it applies to information that you might already be familiar with. And then it's important to look at figures as well. Sometimes figures can be really useful in helping you understand the basic concepts of what's being talked about. Sometimes they might not. My initial inspection of this image is that it's not very intuitive. I don't really know what's going on, but maybe I would have a better understanding after I've read the paper. So then continue to look through. They've got so that was all the method section there, and then they go through results and they talk about so these figures would be useful to look at to see what their results are. And again, although we are focusing on the method section, it's going to be important for you to have that overall understanding of what the paper is accomplishing for your description and for your presentation. So looking at those figures, and then finally in the discussions. And then we have this section here of references. So when you're reading the main body of the text, especially introductions, there will likely be reference to other work that's been done with remote sensing and this particular question. And so you'll want to take that link, let's say we go down here to Baumgartner, and we would find references that might help us. And so this is the beginning article that we would need, and hopefully it would allow us to find at least one or two other references, and then maybe those would help us find additional references along those lines. So let's say this one, monitoring the status of forests and rangelands in the western United States using ecosystem performance anomalies, and this is in the International Journal of Remote Sensing. And so although this might not be specific to cheatgrass, you might find some that have some similar procedures, and you can use those to kind of incorporate. There's a lot of flexibility here. The main goal is that you are able to discuss how these papers are connected and how they can be used to contribute to answer this question that you're posing. So now let's talk about the part 2 of this final project, and that's going to be a presentation. And so again, you're going to be using the template here to base your work on, and the objective is to get a little bit of practice in presenting or in preparing to present the information that you've gathered, which is a little bit of a different process than just writing a paper. So you have this added piece of making things visually appealing. It needs to be informative. It needs to be concise. And concise is a really big one for presentations. I'm sure you've all sat through many presentations that were less than concise. Each of the pieces of information that's presented on the slide and in the notes needs to be condensed and informative. And then the presentation length should be about 15 minutes if it were performed. So again, if you're asking why a PowerPoint presentation is included in a GIS class, we've already spent a lot of time using GIS, and something that a lot of times as natural resources professionals that we forget is that the ability to communicate about the work that we've done, especially using GIS, is really, really important. No one's going to listen to your ideas or your projects if you're not able to communicate those in a visually appealing and concise way. So let's look through this template. You can choose any background that you like. Play around with the different design features of PowerPoint. There's lots of different stuff here. Try and keep it less busy. So something like this might not be great, kind of distracting. So pick something that you like, that you feel speaks to the topic, but make sure that it's not too distracting. Also, you're going to be including note sections on each of the slides, and this is really, really important. If you just include the slides, then we're not going to have any idea of what you actually know. So just like the presentations that I've provided to you with a full note section of what exactly you'd say, this is your opportunity to describe what you would say in this location. So on this introduction slide, you're going to include a description of yourself that you might give if you were giving this public presentation. So then we've got background, description of the topic, include pictures, the citations, and this may be, each of these slides may be multiple slides depending on what you need. So the slide itself should be relatively simple with limited words, limited full sentences, including pictures to make them interesting, and then again a detailed notes section. And as far as citations, at the bottom of the page, when I'm doing a citation, if everything came from there, so if one of these topics came from here, I would say Heward et al. Et al. Meaning everything, and everyone else, 2009. And so that would be a way to cite just one thing on a page. And if the whole page came from there, then you would do inserting a text box. And you would do source, and then Heward et al. 2009. And you're going to have a references page or a slide at the end, and that'll have the full reference. But for in-text, you would just be using those text references. So then you describe the role of GIS. So overview of the general procedures used to answer this question using GIS. So you might find with the cheatgrass example that NDVI is a really common tool, and so you might go into a little description about what NDVI is and why it's useful in analyzing change in those areas. And again, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of research on your own, and that's by design. So after this overview of how GIS is used, then you go into your specific articles. So Article 1, your title and author, and so you would have that listed there. And then overview of the article, and discussion of their methods and how GIS was used. And each article, each article might be several slides, including if there's notable pictures from the article or figures that might help with interpretation of what was done, then include those. And again, bare bones slides with good note sections. And you'll have a slide or several slides for each of the articles. And then your conclusion, an overview of how GIS is used to inform your topic, discussion of other ways that GIS could be used to inform the topic based on your experience with GIS in and outside the class. So maybe some thinking outside the papers here of how else GIS could be used. And then call for further research on the topic, which is, as you'll read some of these papers, which is usually how they end. This is some additional stuff we need to know, for example. And then a slide on what you learned. So what do you learn from this project, either related to GIS or the topic in general? So it could be specific to NDVI, something you found interesting there, or about how much you learned about cheatgrass and what kind of an impact it's having in the Great Basin. And then what were some other main takeaway points from the class as a whole? So maybe include some screen captures of some of your favorite lessons, or it could be based on these management practices that we talked a lot about in class, like from the Grand Canyon, or it could be process-based about different procedures that you are now familiar with and might use in the future. So get creative here with the things that you've learned. And then your references section, which is going to be similar to what you'll have here, except without the descriptions. So you'll have your full references section in alphabetical order. And then you will submit this presentation as your final project. Note that you have several weeks to do this. And it's something that will take you several weeks to do. And so make sure you're spending the appropriate amount of time to prepare for this. It's something that's worth a great deal of points. And so make sure that you're giving it the appropriate amount of time to fulfill those points. And be thinking at that higher level. You are in an academic 400 level class. And so make sure that the product that you're producing is that quality. And that you would feel comfortable producing this kind of presentation or presenting this presentation to someone that you work for, and that you would be proud of it. And maybe you will at some point if they are interested in this exact question. If you do have any questions after doing your own additional work, then please contact us and we will help you stay directed. If you're feeling a little bit lost, it's good to get on track relatively early so that we can help you move in the right direction. Good luck!